This is a jig for making small wooden threaded rods and bolts. The objective was to see if it's possible to make homemade common-sized small bolts, nuts, washers out of wood with the hope of reducing the need to buy store-bought steel parts, and also to open the door to using wood parts for cosmetic reasons. How cool would that be to see a wood color and grain on bolts and nuts? Probably the first question would be, why not use a steel die to cut the threads, something like this guy right here. In doing some experimentation, I couldn't get the standard thread cutting dies to work with wood at all. Here's an example right here of what results when using that type of die cutter for the bolt threads. I tried multiple methods, and for example, I tried steaming the dowel, I tried lubing the dowel, different diameters of dowel, different forces applied to the die, and they all ended up not forming the threads properly, or basically just destroying the threads. So then I experimented with using a bandsaw and scroll saw, but the threads had too much breakout and the blades were too wide for the 1/4 inch threads that I wanted to make on the bolts. Using files would not have caused the breakout issue, and files are thin enough for the 1/4 inch threads, but that method would be too time consuming. This led me to use a Dremel tool that's rigidly mounted to the jig, and it has a thin cutting disc installed right now for 1/4 inch wood bolts. A thicker cutting disc would be used for larger bolts, or could also use multiple thin discs for those larger bolts. This is the 1/4 inch oak dowel that's used for the wood bolt. And there's also a 1/4 inch steel bolt right here that has a nut knob attached to it, and that's used to move the wood dowel into the Dremel cutting disc at the right threading direction and at the correct pitch of 20 threads per inch for a 1/4 inch bolt. For large wood bolts, like say 3/8 inch or 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch for that matter, the same size steel bolt over here would be used. So if you had 3/8 inch wood dowel, you use a 3/8 inch steel bolt over here. The steel bolt right here is connected to the dowel using this wood coupler part right here. So there's a threaded side right here that the steel bolt screws into, and then it's secured with this nut right here, nut and a washer. And then on this side, I have a small set screw that you just screw into, and it locks the wood dowel in on this side. The Dremel tool had to be angled downward at about a 15-degree angle to allow for long dowels to extend over the top of where the dowel is. And this angle, by the way, was cut in the plywood down here using an acute angle jig. That's another video on my channel. You might want to check that out. It made making this cut super easy. There's also a cutout right here in the clamp that holds down the Dremel tool. There's this little notch right here that allows for the wood dowel to go through where that clamp area is well. This jig assembly right here, it pivots up and down for setting the depth of the cut that you're going to make in the threads, but it will also pivot up a lot more, and that's to get access to here for replacing this cutting disc. Precise thread cutting depth is adjusted with this 1/4 inch hex bolt. Tightening the bolt decreases the thread cut, and loosening the bolt increases the thread cut. And what it's doing is it's pivoting this part either up or down, and that's in turn pivoting the dowel part up or down against the cutting disc. Pivoting the assembly up also allows you to crank on the nut knob, and that will move the dowel inward or outward. In this case, I'm moving it outward, and so that you can have areas on the bolt that have no threads. So right there, this area right here is going to have no threads. Also with this jig, the threaded rod is interoperable with steel parts, like say the a steel hex nut. That guy just screws onto that. Fits pretty good. And the reverse also, you can take a steel bolt and then screw on a wooden nut into that guy. So this jig actually makes threaded rods. To make a bolt, what you do is you take a wooden nut, you add glue to the threads, and then you'll tighten that down onto the threaded rod. Wait for it to dry, maybe clean off the excess back here, and now you end up with a bolt. The threaded rod or bolt can be attached to other things. I've got just a piece of wood here that has a threaded hole in it, and that guy right there can just screw down into that, and now you've got a nice solid joint right there. It's attaching those things together. The threaded nuts were made with a length of oak wood cut to a hex shape using the table saw set to 30-degree outside angle bevel cuts. For the case of 1/4 inch hex nuts, the dimensions are 7/16 from this surface here to this surface right here, and about 1/2 inch from this point right here to this point right here. Just like with 1/4 inch steel bolts and nuts, a standard 7/16 wrench can be used. The next step is a small section of this hex stock material is cut off with either a table saw crosscut sled or a bandsaw. After cutting out the nuts to the desired width, the next step is to drill a hole in the center of the nut, and the diameter of the hole can be found on the web for machine bolts or by measuring the inside diameter of the thread tap tool that we're going to use next. The last step is to use a standard tapping tool. This is the same one that would be used for metal tapping nuts, and you just take that wooden nut and you'll tap it the same way that you do a metal nut. And surprisingly, this tapping tool works really good on these wooden nuts. I haven't figured out quite why the tapping tool works so good, but the die tool doesn't work good for making threading the bolts. Other size nuts can be made with the same process. Larger sizes, or even just larger outside hex size, will be easier to cut out and tap. Also, different length nuts can be made with the same process. For example, to make a coupler nut. Making the wood washers is the easy part. It's just a dowel crosscut to the desired width, and with a hole in the center. Again, the diameter and the thickness of the washer can be customized, and other things can be done, like gluing the washers to nuts and bolts. The jig tilt assembly can be swapped out for other bolt sizes, like 3/8 inch, 1/2 inch, or 3/4 inch. I started using the 1/4 inch bolt size because this is the one I most often use, and I knew it would be the most difficult compared to larger bolts and nuts. Only the tilt assembly needs to be changed. All the rest of this jig stays the same. From what I can tell, the 1/4 inch bolts and nuts are acceptably strong considering they're made out of wood, but I didn't do testing to failure. Maybe I'll do that on a future video. There's a Dimension 3D SketchUp CAD model for this thread cutting project if interested in making it. And if any questions or improvements for this project, please feel free to comment. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe to my channel for more.